Today we're diving into some of the darkest corners of human history. Like seriously, this is some really messed up stuff. We're talking about experiments that were unethical, inhumane, and downright terrifying. These are the 20 most disturbing human experiments ever conducted. Experiments that crossed lines, exploited the vulnerable, and left lasting scars on individuals and our understanding of ethics. Get ready to go down a rabbit hole of conspiracies, medical horrors, and psychological manipulation because some of this stuff is straight out of a horror movie. Imagine being told you were receiving free health care, only to discover you were part of a sinister experiment. Hundreds of African American men in the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. For 40 years, these men were denied treatment for syphilis. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, but researchers were just watching the disease ravage their bodies. A story of racism, medical malpractice, and devastating consequences. Have you ever wondered what happens when ordinary people gain power? The Stanford Prison Experiment sought to answer that, with shocking results. Students were randomly assigned as guards or prisoners. The study quickly spiraled out of control. Guards became abusive, prisoners became submissive and traumatized, and it was shut down after 6 days. A chilling reminder of how easily we can lose our humanity. How far would you go if someone in authority told you to hurt another person? The Milgram experiment explored the dark side of obedience. Participants were told to deliver electric shocks to another person, who was actually an actor. The shocks weren't real, but the participants believed they were. Many continued to deliver shocks simply because an authority figure told them to. The monster study messing with young minds. This experiment is truly horrifying, guys. It's called the monster study for a reason. Imagine being a young orphan, already vulnerable and unsure of the world. That's what happened to a group of orphans in Iowa in the 1930s. Researchers wanted to see if they could induce stuttering in children. They would belittle the children and destroy their self-esteem. It's heartbreaking and infuriating. Unit 731, Japan's Gruesome War Crimes. This is a dark chapter in human history, and it's one that many people don't even know about. During World War II, the Japanese Imperial Army operated a secret biological and chemical warfare research unit known as Unit 731. What happened there was truly horrific. Prisoners of war, including women and children, were subjected to unimaginable torture in the name of scientific research. We're talking vivisections without anesthesia, germ warfare experiments, and forced pregnancies. It's truly the stuff of nightmares. The Aversion Project, a shocking chapter of discrimination. Imagine being persecuted for your sexual orientation, then subjected to horrific experiments. That's the reality faced by gay soldiers in South Africa during apartheid. The Aversion Project was conducted by the South African military from the 70s to the 80s. Gay soldiers were subjected to chemical castration, electric shock therapy, and forced sex change operations. It's a chilling example of prejudice and ignorance manifesting in horrific ways. This is some real X-Files stuff right here. Project MKUltra was a top-secret CIA program from the 50s to the 70s. The goal? To develop mind control techniques for the Cold War. They experimented with LSD, hypnosis, electroshock therapy, and sensory deprivation. Often using unwitting subjects, people who had no idea. It's a terrifying reminder of the government's potential for overreach. This experiment is just plain wrong. It involved a 9-month-old baby known as Little Albert. Researchers wanted to see if they could condition a fear response in a human child. So they repeatedly paired the presentation of a white rat, which Albert was initially unafraid of, with a loud, scary noise. Guess what? It worked. Albert developed a phobia of white rats, and the researchers never even attempted to decondition him. Poor little Albert. This experiment is a horrifying example of how vulnerable populations can be exploited in the name of medical research. From the 1950s to the 1970s, researchers at the Willowbrook State School, an institution for children with intellectual disabilities, intentionally infected children with hepatitis. They claimed it was justified because the children were likely to contract the disease anyway in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of the institution. But that's no excuse for intentionally infecting vulnerable children with a serious illness. It's just plain wrong. Chapter 10. The Nazi Experiments, the Ultimate Horror. The Nazi experiments during World War II are the epitome of medical evil. These weren't experiments, they were acts of torture and genocide disguised as science. Jewish people, Roma people, people with disabilities and other groups deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime were subjected to horrific experiments in concentration camps. We're talking about everything from freezing people to death, to testing the effects of poisonous gas. It's a dark stain on human history. The Holmesburg Prison Experiments testing drugs on prisoners. Prisons can be breeding grounds for exploitation, and the Holmesburg Prison Experiments are a prime example. From the 1950s to the 1970s, inmates at Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia were subjected to a wide range of medical experiments. They were exposed to everything from radioactive materials to mind-altering drugs, often without their informed consent. It's a story of power imbalances, desperation, and the ethical lines that can be crossed when vulnerable populations are involved. The Guatemala Syphilis Experiment. A nation betrayed. Imagine being intentionally infected with a sexually transmitted disease by your own government. That's what happened to hundreds of Guatemalans in the 1940s. The U.S. Public Health Service, with the cooperation of the Guatemalan government, conducted experiments on prisoners, soldiers, and mental patients. They infected them with syphilis and other STDs without their knowledge or consent, all in the name of studying the effectiveness of penicillin. It's a shameful chapter in U.S. history, and a reminder of the importance of ethical research practices. The Human Radiation Experiments, the Invisible Threat. The Cold War was a time of paranoia and fear, and it led to some truly unethical experiments. During this era, the United States government conducted radiation experiments on its own citizens, often without their knowledge or consent. People were exposed to radioactive materials, given radioactive injections, and subjected to radiation therapy, all in the name of studying the effects of radiation on the human body. It's a terrifying example of how far governments will go in the name of national security. The Tea Room Trade Study, a violation of privacy. This study is seriously messed up. Conducted in the 70s, it involved spying on men in public restrooms. Researcher Laud Humphreys even followed some men to their homes. The study raised serious ethical concerns about privacy and consent. The Landis Facial Expressions Experiment forcing emotions. Imagine being forced to decapitate a live rat in the name of science. This was part of the Landis Facial Expressions Experiment in the 1920s. Participants faced stimuli like rat decapitation, jazz music, and ammonia. Their reactions were photographed and studied to understand facial expressions' universality. It's a prime example of knowledge pursuit going too far. The Robbers Cave Experiment manufacturing conflict. What happens when you take a group of innocent boys, divide them into groups, and pit them against each other? The Robbers Cave Experiment, conducted in the 1950s, sought to answer that question. Researchers created artificial groups among boys at a summer camp, fostering competition and prejudice between them. The experiment showed how easily intergroup conflict can be created and escalated, even among individuals with no prior animosity. The David Reimer case, a life stolen. This one is truly heartbreaking. David Reimer's story is a tragic example of medical intervention gone wrong. Ignoring a person's gender identity has devastating consequences. After a botched circumcision, David was raised as a girl named Brenda on a psychologist's advice. He struggled with his gender identity and transitioned back to male. Sadly, he took his own life at 38. The Monster Study messing with young minds. Again? Wait, haven't we talked about this one already? It's so messed up it deserves a second mention. This experiment just goes to show how far some researchers are willing to go in the name of science, even if it means harming innocent children. The fact that they called it the Monster Study should tell you everything you need to know about its ethical implications. The Pit of Despair, torturing monkeys in the name of science. This experiment is just straight up cruel. In the 1970s, psychologist Harry Harlow conducted experiments on monkeys to study the effects of social isolation and attachment. Baby monkeys were separated from their mothers and placed in isolation chambers, often referred to as pits of despair. These chambers were barren, metal cages with no social interaction or comfort. The monkeys became severely depressed, withdrawn, and some even died. The Aversion Project, One Last Shock. This experiment is another example of how prejudice and discrimination can manifest in horrific ways. The fact that it happened relatively recently, from the 1970s to the 1980s, shows how deeply ingrained these prejudices can be. The Aversion Project is a reminder that we must always be vigilant in fighting for equality and justice for all people, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. The dark side of science. Never forget. These experiments remind us of the lengths humans can go in the name of science. They force us to confront the dark side of human nature and the potential for abuse of power. We must remember that the capacity for evil still exists today. Be vigilant, ask questions, and hold those in power accountable. Like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's darkest moments.